Thank you, Richard. I'm grateful for the opportunity this morning to thank you as a congregation for the experience that you gave Brandon Thomas during his time at Emmanuel. And I remember a long time ago, those days when I was a student minister in the state of Oklahoma, and what that particular church meant to me in terms of what I thought I was giving to them, but at the end of the day, it was what they gave to me in terms of pastoral care and love and the opportunity. So thank you very much. I had an opportunity, even though Brendan came to Emmanuel after I retired, I did have an occasion to get acquainted with him. So, whoops, need to be up a little bit. Okay, thank you. How's that? Any better? Okay, I'll try to keep my voice up as well. We had this reading from the Old Testament, 1 Samuel. Have you ever thought of how many names that we use today are derived from the Old Testament? Of course, Samuel, David, Joseph, Rebecca, Rachel, Ruth, Daniel, Esther, Joel, and many more. And most people who bear those names today probably don't even realize that they are biblical names. Now, there was a time when, and I think this probably goes back to our frontier experience, where maybe the Bible was the only book in the home, that they didn't stop at just the ordinary names like David and Rachel, but they came up with names like Josiah, Phineas, Ichabod, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and somewhere there was probably a little boy named Lamentation, and maybe rightly named, I don't know. But 1 Samuel 7:12 gives us the name Ebenezer. Now, I have never met an Ebenezer, and if you have, I would be interested, because I think it was probably Charles Dickens that ruined that name for us as far as passing it on to our children, because you will remember in the Christmas Carol, he calls his old skinflint miser Ebenezer Scrooge. And somehow or other, when we hear the name Ebenezer today, we probably identify it immediately with Scrooge. And that's not a very pleasant memory. And yet, here is this name that is so prominent in the Old Testament, particularly in a hymn that we sing from time to time. And I think we all know it, don't we? Come thou fount of every blessing. I'm watching for head shakes here, because I confess this is an old sermon that I have, and I used to, when I traveled for Emmanuel, that was one of the advantages, to get a good sermon, and I could use it week after week. But anyhow, I was at this large church in Oregon, and it was a contemporary service. I mean, they had big crowds. They had Saturday night service, 2 services on Sunday, and they had a song leader that must have learned to do his song leading in gymnastics. I mean, he was all over that platform when he led these new contemporary courses. And it was a very lively occasion. So on Saturday night, I got up and started my sermon, and I said, how many of you remember that old hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing? Not a hand went up. There were probably 300 or 400 people there. And so I thought, well, this is a sermon I have, so I've got to preach it. And so I went ahead with it. Sunday morning, 8 o'clock, same thing happened. 300 or 400 people, not a one knew it. And the 11 o'clock service, the young people had just come back from summer camp. And here were 100 high school youngsters over here. And I thought, I am dead in the water with this particular sermon. So I started it again. How many of you know that old hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing? And so help me, every one of those young people shot their hand up in the air. Well, what I didn't know was that a contemporary singer, David Crowder, had made an upbeat version of that. It's still the same melody. He emphasizes a little bit more of the Celtic sound to it, a little bit of beat in the background. But they all knew it. I got so excited, I left the pulpit and went over and preached to these 100 kids. But you remember the second stanza of that hymn?
Here I raise my Ebenezer.
There we go. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good promise safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger, interposed with precious blood. Well, when I was a boy, and we were singing that hymn, and we came to that second stanza, here I raise my Ebenezer. Well, my friends and I didn't know what an Ebenezer was, and we sure didn't know how you'd raise it. It was just a funny name, and we would crack up laughing every time we sang that hymn. It was to be years later before I realized just how precious that second stanza was. And so it is in this particular account in 1 Samuel 7 that we have the Ebenezer account. Okay? And what was happening there was that this was a time in the life of Israel when they had settled in the Promised Land and they were under oppression by the Philistines. You know, it's rather ironic. We use this expression, the Promised Land, and you know, the children of Israel wandered around out there in the wilderness for about 40 years, and God said, now, when they came to the River Jordan, here's the Promised Land. All you have to do is take it away from the people who now have it. Can you imagine someone saying to you, I want to give you a house. And they take you to a very exclusive part of the town, and you see this big, beautiful house, and they say, here it is. I'm giving it to you. All you have to do is take it away from the person who now owns it. And you see a pickup in the driveway, and it has a gun rack in it. And maybe you can appreciate the words of Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, that Jewish merchant, when he says, Lord, I know we are your promised people, but just once, couldn't you choose someone else? Well, God did not choose someone else. He chose Israel. He was making them a people of the covenant, a promised people. And when they did his will, he blessed them. And when they strayed from his will, then he, as a loving father, he chided them, he punished them. And the story here in 1 Samuel 7 picks up when Israel had been under the oppression of the Philistines. Now they came under the power of the Philistines in two ways. Number one, they were worshiping the gods of the Philistines, the gods and goddesses of the Philistines, these pagan deities, the Baals and the Ashtoreths, okay? And whenever you worship someone else's god, you come under the power of that worshiping community. And I want you to think about that. Jesus referred to the god Mammon, wealth, okay? And if a person worships wealth, I mean, that is their highest value. They want to do everything they can to become wealthy, even if it means stepping on other people, even if it means destroying family, then they are worshiping the god Mammon. And they come under the power of that worshiping community. Okay? The other people who are trying to do that. When you worship someone else's god, you come under the power of that worshiping community. And of course, the second way that the Israelites came under the power of the Philistines was politically. Philistia was a powerful country, and they simply had these continual battles, and at times they simply controlled Israel. So this was the situation in which they found themselves. And finally, the people repented. Okay? They put away their Baals and their Ashtoreths. By the way, has it ever occurred to you how curious it is as to why people would want to worship an idol? Seems strange, doesn't it? Well, I think there's a very good explanation. These Baals and Ashtoreths were fertility gods and goddesses. Now, when the Israelites first came into the Promised Land, they weren't farmers. They were shepherds out there in the wilderness. Where did they learn their farming technique? Probably from the people who were already there. And part and parcel to the farming technique of the pagan Philistines was the worship of the fertility deities. It was like this. You got your land ready. You went out and you prepared the soil. You planted the seed. And then you went down to the temple to worship the fertility deities that would make the plants grow. Just like putting fertilizer on the lawn right now. Okay? And so, in other words, this idea of worshiping the fertility deities was part and parcel to the practice of the Philistines. Now, why would an Israelite who had been given the knowledge of God, okay, who had the law, who in effect was, Mount Sinai was being held over their heads, okay, why in the world would they start worshiping these deities? Well, I said these were fertility deities, and the practice of worshiping involves sexual orgies. Can't you just see this Israelite saying to his wife, well, I know you don't want me to go down to the pagan temple tonight with all that raucous sexuality going on, but you do want good crops, don't you? Well, women have a way of rationalizing these things. But in any event, for one reason or other, the Israelites were worshiping those deities. They finally realized that it was destructive, and they turned to God. They repented, and they turned to their judge, Samuel, and asked that he intercede. And so he calls this great revival meeting at Mizpah. They pour out the water as a symbol of purification. They offer the sacrifice, and God intercedes in that situation. And consequently, that when the Philistines hear this big revival meeting going on up at Mizpah, I can imagine one Philistine general saying to another, well, those squirrely Hebrews got religion again. I guess we'll have to go up and teach them a lesson. And so they organized their army and they marched on Mizpah. But this time, as they approached the Israelites, God interceded with his own artillery, thunder and lightning that terrified the Philistines. And they turned to run. The Israelites, these weak-kneed people who were under submission, suddenly became warriors. They charged out of Mizpah. They followed the Philistines, and they won a great victory. They won? No, it was God's victory. Okay? And so Samuel moved very quickly to help them remember that it was not their strength that did it, but it was God who did it. And so he puts up what must have been a monolith of some kind, because the word Ebenezer in the Hebrews means stone of help. Okay? And he puts up this stone and he says, thus far, God has helped us. Thus far, God has helped us. Notice the qualification there? Well, the good positive side is that whenever they saw that stone, which they called Ebenezer, they would remember how God helped them. But they would also remember that it was not their strength that did it, but rather it was God working through them. And there is the qualification that thus far God has helped us. Doesn't say that God's always going to help us, because we might turn our backs on God again. And I find this to be so very true of our experience in the church. There are times, or maybe I just should say the Christian life. There are times when we are tempted to turn. We're tempted to look back on the world. We're tempted to forget how God has blessed us in so many ways. And we have to be reminded that thus far, God has helped us. We do not accept the doctrine of once in grace, always in grace, because we have seen too many people in our lives that somehow came into Christ, accepted Jesus, and something came up and they turned their backs and they walked away. And we can give you plenty of examples in Scripture that illustrate that. There are times when we do become discouraged. There are times when we feel that maybe this has all been an illusion. But we must remember that God has only brought us to this morning, thus far, as God helped us. While we were living in England, Richard, I would have a chance on Sundays to go out and speak to our churches over the country. And my wife and I would sometimes take a whole weekend to do it, do a little bit of touring. And we had heard about Lincoln Cathedral up in the northeast part of the country. And so we went there on, I think it was on a Saturday. And Lincoln, very impressive cathedral, by the way, it's a relatively small town. And as we were approaching the town, you could see the cathedral way up over all of the other buildings in the town. But what surprised us was that when we saw the town sign that said Lincoln, its logo was a little devil. And I thought, what a curious logo for a cathedral town, because they prided themselves on being a cathedral town. And when we got into the town and we went to a tourist shop or two, here were little images of this devil that they called the Lincoln Imp. And it wasn't until we went to the cathedral that we found out the story on that. Because in the Middle Ages, people would travel days, weeks, maybe months on pilgrimages. And they would come to a cathedral, this particular cathedral. And when they arrived, they would be met on the steps by a priest. And he would take them through the doors on the pilgrim's path. And you can actually see the yellow brick tiles. What does that sound like? Anyhow, the yellow brick tiles that lead the pilgrims around the side to the aisle. They would go around to the aisle, and here would be a little chapel, an apostolic chapel it's called. And they would stop there, and they'd have a worship service. And then he'd dismiss them. And maybe they'd go down to the marketplace. The next morning they're back, start at the front door, follow the path, down the aisle, past the first chapel, to another chapel, another service. Of course, these services probably go on for a couple hours, but then he dismisses them. Now this goes on all week until they finally work their way around to the high altar, to the most sacred place in the church, made sacred, by the way, because they had some bones of saints. Well, you have to do something with the bones of ex-preachers, but in any event, they finally get to this altar here, and it is at that point that the priest gives them absolution of their sins. But as they stand up and look up on the left side at the top of one of the columns, in some filigree up there, there is this little devil sitting there. He's got his legs crossed, which, by the way, you never did during prayer in those services, okay? So that's a symbol of disrespect, to have the legs crossed. And he's got his arms crossed. And he's looking down on these pilgrims. And his eyes are rubies, so that when light comes in through the stained glass window, they just seem to be red. And he's got this demonic grin on his face, as though he's saying to the pilgrims, you think you are so holy and righteous. Just wait. I'm still up here biding my time. I'm still watching you. Well, I don't know what you think about pilgrimages and absolution services, but I know this, that the Lincoln imp is not the first devil to ever make his way into a church. That Satan is always looking for an opportunity to destroy the peace of a church, to destroy the lives of individuals, that he is present, and so consequently, even in our most joyous, ecstatic moments as Christians, we still must say with Samuel, thus far the Lord has helped us. Thus far. Whether he will continue to help us depends on our willingness to remain faithful to him. And that is why we come back to that hymn, come down out of every blessing. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor, daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart. Oh, take and seal it. Seal it for the courts above.